For the last few weeks, we've been talking about the Lenten tools of fasting and praying and how they can have a profound effect on our spiritual evolution. Fasting can help us remember our spiritual goals every time we have the urge to partake of whatever it is we've given up for Lent. Fasting can also help form an inner resolve and strength that we can use then to stay on track or to accomplish anything we want. Praying can help connect you with the universal omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence that many call God. Prayer plugs us into this power and it enables us to access guidance. It activates in us a place of peace and wisdom and the realization of the divine order of things that we so often lose track of. It helps us see reality, not just our projections of reality. Seeing the truth of what is and not the illusions that we create is called enlightenment. And this state is possible for every one of us. Every spiritual teacher and every religion has told us that this is so. The one we probably know best, of course, is Jesus, who said, "These things that I do, ye shall do also, and greater." And this certainly includes understanding. The kingdom of heaven is always at hand. We just need to access it. All we need to do is go from seeing through a glass darkly to finally seeing face to face. Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore said in his seminal book, Keep a True Lent, man's primary work is to use his creative power to preserve harmony and order in his world and to preserve his powers for divine direction. There is a region of being, he says, in us which provides all ideas for the production of the beautiful in life, and it is always at our disposal. Fillmore goes on to discuss his famous 12 powers of man and how they are available to all of us, and we can use them to accomplish things, be they attaining enlightenment or transforming the world in some way. These 12 powers, which most of us know, are strength, wisdom, love, faith, prayer, imagination, understanding, will, order, zeal, renunciation, and life. Faith, he says, is the perceiving power of the mind linked with the power to shape substance on the physical plane, to do the seemingly impossible. Strength is freedom from weakness, stability of character, the force or power to do. Wisdom allows us to listen to our inner voice. Love is the idea of universal unity, the power that joins and binds us all together in the universe and everything with everything in the universe. Imagination can carry out any set of ideas by manifesting them in form. Understanding is that which knows how to accomplish things. Will is the executive power of the mind that knows that it is possible to do whatever, to do good works, and remembering, not my will, but thine. Zeal is the mighty force that incites action, the eternal urge behind all things. And Fillmore assures us that we can all access these 12 powers and that when we do, we can transform and regenerate ourselves and our world. It allows us to enter into what Fillmore calls the fourth dimension, a dimension of being where we are no longer limited by what we now consider to be the physical plane. Fillmore says that the scientific prayer what he calls scientific prayer, or going into the silence, which he did an hour a day, enables this to happen, which is why we've been talking about prayer so much during Lent. Fasting and praying are two of the main tools that help us all evolve. Well, today, I'd like to share with you the story of a person who has developed what Fillmore called the 12 powers. As a result, this person is content despite major setbacks in his life, and he also improved the lives of everyone around him. This man's life is a walking meditation. Every movement, every detail of his existence, every second is a testimony to this evolution. This man is enlightened. He lives in the kingdom of heaven because he produced it in himself and in his environment. The story seems to say that if this humble man, who by worldly standards has absolutely nothing, can create this state for himself and for all those around him, that you and I can too. His very being transforms everything he touches. He is selfless, but determined, humble, yet an aristocrat of the soul, a Brahmin. He embodies the Christ consciousness as portrayed in every religion and philosophical school. The story is entitled The Man Who Planted Trees. Has anyone in here ever read it? Wow, that's wonderful. Somebody has read it. I translated it for you from the French, actually. The main character, Elzéard Bouffier, can be described as a modern Christ figure. I think that this story and The Little Prince are the two most spiritual stories of the 20th century. And I know a lot of you have read The Little Prince. This is on that par. And incidentally, did you know that The Little Prince is the most translated book in the world next to the Bible, which I consider a verification of the evolution of mankind? The narrator of The Man Who Planted Trees says of the man whom he is describing in the story, and I'm quoting now, or translating, and I apologize, only a poet really can translate this book, and I am not a poet, but the story is accurate, and I felt like you really deserved it. In order for the true character of an exceptional being of quality, a being of quality, to be truly unveiled, it is necessary to observe his actions over many years. If those actions are devoid of all egotism, if the idea that drives this being is of a generosity without example, if it is certain that the person doesn't look for any reward for what he does, yet he leaves a visible mark on the world, then, unmistakably, he is an unforgettable character, an athlete of God, God's athlete. The narrator starts. The story goes, years ago, I took a long hike through the hills of Provence in France. I had been walking all day and I was very tired and thirsty. Then in the distance, I saw a solitary figure. As I approached him, I saw a humble sheep herder who was tending his flock of 30. The sheep were grazing peacefully on the hot and barren ground. When I approached the shepherd, he quickly offered me water from his canteen and invited me to accompany him to his home. He then offered me more water, clean and cool, from his deep, natural well, above which he had installed a pulley. The well was an oasis in this barren land. Now, from the very first paragraph of the story, the scene is set. We identify with the narrator who is tired and thirsty. Life often beats us down during our journeys, and we need sustenance. We are tired. We have need of sustenance. And in this case, the symbol is water. The water spoken of is the same water that Jesus spoke of in the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus said, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never thirst again. The water that I give will become in them a spring gushing up to eternal life." The water that this humble shepherd gave to the narrator was this living water, because the narrator would be transformed by his experience with the shepherd. The narrator in the story continues. "This man spoke very little, but he was sure of himself and confident when he did speak. Such confidence was unusual in the area, so barren and stripped of everything. This shepherd didn't live in a meager cabin like everyone else, all the inhabitants in the area lived in, but in a real home made of stone. One could easily see the quality of his life. He had patched up the ruin that he had found there upon his arrival. His roof was now solid and waterproof, and the tiles were secure. His house was in perfect order. His floor was swept. All was clean, and there was fresh soup boiling on the stove, even though he lived alone. He invited me to retire there for the night. I noticed that Elziard was clean-shaven. The buttons on his clothes were sewn solidly. His clothes were mended with such minute care that you couldn't even see the stitches. They were invisible. He shared his soup with me. I offered him some tobacco, but he didn't smoke. Elziard's dog was silent like his master, friendly without servility. I learned that this area of the country was inhabited by woodcutters. The conditions were bad. The families fought about everything. They had all kinds of resentments toward each other, and everyone competed for everything, even the best seats at church. It seemed like the people's nerves were frayed, and there were epidemics of suicide and madness, almost always murderous. There were few natural resources. The climate was tough in the hot summers and freezing in the winters, and there was very little water. The people were virtually cut off from the outside world, and everyone wanted to escape from this region. That night, Elziard went to get a little sack, and he dumped from it a full pouch of seeds. He started very carefully examining them, one after another, separating the good from the bad ones. I offered to help him, but he refused and said that I should just relax. Seeing the extreme care that he put into this work, I didn't insist further. So I just watched him and smoked my pipe. Elziard eliminated all the good seeds from the dark or cracked ones, examining each one closely. When he had 100 perfect seeds, he stopped and he placed them carefully in a pouch, and we resumed our quiet time together. The company of this man created peace. I asked him the next day if I could spend the day with him before continuing my journey. He accepted. He gave me the impression that nothing bothered him. This rest wasn't absolutely necessary on my part, but I was intrigued and wanted to know more about him. Before leaving on our walk together, Elziard took his flock to the pasture. Then he soaked in water the pouch of 100 seeds that he had carefully chosen. When this was done, we left with the seeds. When we arrived at the place where he wanted to go, he dug a hole in which he placed one of these perfect seeds. Then he filled the hole back up. He did this all day. Elzéard was planting oak trees. I asked him if the land was his, and he answered no. He didn't have any idea who it belonged to. He supposed that it was communal land, or maybe it belonged to someone who didn't care about it. He wasn't at all concerned about whose land it was. Each day he just planted each of these 100 seeds with extreme care. For 3 years, Elzéard had been planting trees in solitude every day. He had planted 100,000 trees. Of the 100,000, 20,000 had grown. Of these 20,000, he had lost half of them to rodents or natural disasters. 10,000 trees remained in this region, where before there had been none. Elzéard was about 50 years old when I met him. He had at one time owned a farm down on the plain. He had lived a good life, but he had lost his only son, and then his wife had died. He then retired in solitude, where he lived a slower life with his sheep and a dog. He had decided that this area was dying because of a lack of trees. And since he was no longer working to support a family, he had resolved to remedy that state of things. I told him that in 30 years these trees would be magnificent. He answered simply that if God granted him life, that in 30 years he would have planted far more than these 10,000, and that they would be only a drop in the sea compared to what would be here then. The following year was the start of the First World War. I had to fight for 5 years. I hardly had time to think about Elzéard or the trees. But after the war, I made my way back to Elzéard's home. He had changed professions. He had only 4 sheep left. Instead, he was raising bees because the sheep were putting in peril his tree plantation. The trees had thrived and were now taller than I was. It was impressive. I was literally speechless and spent the day walking through his forest, admiring these trees 30 miles long and 7 miles wide, where before there had been nothing but barren and dry land. When I thought about how, from the hands and the soul of just one man with no modern methods, this beautiful forest had been created, I realized that people could be effective in pursuits other than destruction and war. As I wandered around the village, I saw running water and streams where before all had been dry since Roman times. The rabbit and wild boar hunters had noticed how many trees there were, but they thought it was all a natural phenomenon, so they didn't do anything about it. And no one told Elzéard to stop. If they had suspected what he was doing, trespassing, they would surely have stopped him. Elzéard was above reproach. Who could have imagined such an act of kindness? From 1920 on, I never went a year without visiting Elzéard. I never saw him doubt himself or weaken despite his many setbacks. I can just imagine how many there were on such a project. He must have struggled a lot with failures and discouragement in order to produce such a victory. To have any idea of the passion and zeal of this exceptional character, one must realize that he did it all alone, so alone that by the end of his life he had lost the habit of talking, or perhaps he didn't see the necessity to do so. In 1933, the forest rangers came to the region. They were astonished at what they saw. They ordered that a no-fire law be instituted to protect this natural forest. The director said that it was the first time they had ever seen a whole forest grow all by itself. In 1935, a forest administrative delegation came to examine this natural forest. The director had a lot to say about it. They decided to do something, and they made big plans for this forest and all the things they were going to do. But the people in charge never got around to it, so fortunately, the forest was left to flourish. The forest also survived the Second World War. Because of the war's need for gasoline, most of the cars driven by civilians had to use a type of gas made from wood. And many trees were cut down all over France, but this forest was too far from the factories to transport the trees. So it survived. Thus, Elzéard Bouffier didn't know anything about the Second World War any more than he knew about the first. I saw Elzéard for the last time in 1945 when he was 87. I noticed at the time that the villages in the area were now growing. What had formerly been desolate land and ruin was now covered with trees 20 feet high. Children were playing, streams were running where there had been a desert before, and there was visible joy that abounded everywhere. Life was peaceful. The frugality, serenity, wisdom, faith, and steady work of Elzéard Bouffier had transformed the entire region. The people in the region now had hope. Everything had changed. Instead of dry and brutal wind squalls, there were gentle breezes filled with fresh mint and herbs. There were fountains and wells. Flowers thrived. There was even a linden tree, symbol of resurrection. The villagers were renovating old ruins and houses, and vegetable gardens thrived in abundance. The area had become a place where people wanted to live. The town was coming to life. Beauty and health abounded in this place that had been dead for thousands of years. Young people were moving there, and everyone was joyful to be working together. They were even planning new city celebrations and feasts. Soon 10,000 people were thriving where only 12 families had lived in misery before. When you think that just one man reduced to his simple resources was able to make such a beautiful and joyful place spring up from a desert ruin, you know that despite everything, the human condition is admirable. I am filled in my heart with respect for this old peasant Elzéard. He had little culture or education, and he had endured much sadness in his life, but he accomplished a great and noble work. He was an athlete of God. Elzéard died peacefully in 1947 at a little nursing home in Provence. That's the end of the story, but it was the beginning of a new life for the narrator of the story. He was nourished by the living water of his experience with Elzéard Bouffier. May this time of Lent be a time when you too will be open and open yourselves to another level of existence wherein you will flourish and your life will be a prayer and you will change the life of everything and everyone around you. Amen.